Thank you for joining me for week 11 of the Me and White Supremacy virtual pilgrimage. This week we are talking again about anti-blackness specifically, and today is Anti-Blackness Against Black Children. And just before we get there, Layla Saad, the author of Me and White Supremacy, has said that it's important to think about the content that we're going to be speaking of because this can be triggering for BIPOC. And so before you continue to watch this video, just make sure you're taking care of yourself and making that decision as to whether or not you want to keep listening. Layla has decided for several of these chapters, and the last couple of weeks and today as well, to identify specifically and draw out anti-blackness as a part of this journey around anti-racism. And I've been struck by the ways in which I find these chapters have really sort of stirred up something within me, and I want to stay with that. I want to work with that. I want to continue to reflect on that for my own self personally, in how I engage with this conversation about anti-blackness. So powerfully, a phrase that came up as a part of this discussion in the book that's really stuck to me, and I want to continue to work on anti-racism and learning the practice of anti-racism with this sort of mantra, that as we encounter this material, we need to excavate. We need to find the stuff that's within inside of us, not just sort of deny and say, well, I don't do that. That's not me. I would never be that way. We've already talked about the ways in which that is part of being bound up in white privilege and white supremacy. So excavating, confronting, and then owning either your actions, your thoughts, the way you navigate the world, whatever that is, excavating, confronting, and then owning it can help us on this journey to practice anti-racism. Today, it's anti-racism against black children. And as I reflected on the chapter here, some things that came up for me that were sort of my reflections, my excavation around this area. I have a couple of connection points in this journey of being a minister in a church. And so the first one I want to talk about is how when my son was born, a white, red-haired baby, and the church I was serving was over half of the population within the church was either originally from Africa, West Africa, Ghana mostly, or the Caribbean, mostly Guyana and Trinidad. Over half the congregation that was a congregation I served in Toronto. And we had many, many black children, predominantly Ghanaian. And this was a congregation that didn't have a nursery. And so what I found interesting in that congregation, that when my son was born, the conversation around the leadership that was mostly white, or at least the white voices were the ones that were listened to more often than the black voices or BIPOC voices, felt that we needed to have a nursery. But this congregation had been going for quite some time and had never identified the need for a nursery. Now, I had raised it up on numerous occasions, and we had a room. It was this really interesting setup where there was the sanctuary, and then there was this sort of space that had these glass windows, almost like a production studio where, you have the people behind the glass while someone else does some things. And they called that the crying room. And they said that was satisfactory. When I came, I said, well, we have lots of kids. Now, to be fair, the church was physically connected to a seniors residence. And so a lot of a seniors kind of mindset, but the young people in the church who came from the community were from these places that I've already identified. And they came as young families with kids. When the minister had his first child, a white child, for some reason, the nursery conversation came up. And for those of you who don't fully understand maybe ministers and their roles in churches, the other thing that I found interesting, and someone could push back and say, well, that's just because it was the minister's kid. I found it very interesting to bear witness to the ways in which my kid was singled out regularly as special and important and valued and of interest to the community around me versus There being lots of other kids, lots of other babies, all black, but not as much interest. But when my son came along, people wanted to hold him. People wanted to, celebrate him. People would point him out. And I just found that very, very odd and uncomfortable. Now, again, some people will push and say, well, that's just because he was the minister's kid. But I didn't feel right about how that community singled out my child, especially because he was white, it seemed. And so this chapter today really drew a little bit of that out for me. The other thing I was very interested about is how, and I've read this in other places and I've seen this in other stories, certainly in Canada, where black children, especially when they hit the teenage years, become more identified, and the chapter draws this out, more identified as, problematic, more like adults, she identifies, than you'd ever treat a white child, it seems. And that's the reality. That's the stories that are told and the way in which black children navigate a school system. Sometimes that's how that comes out. And I have seen examples of that even in a church where older black children or BIPOC children are perceived differently than perhaps white children of a similar age. There's a lot more judgment that comes into that, a lot more a need to control kind of feeling that comes that I've felt in the church over the years I've served the churches, not just here and other places, but just a sense within church communities that that's kind of the way we must understand it. So this chapter really brings up some of these things for me to think about, to do that excavation work, to confront it for my own self personally. Not to, please don't get me wrong, I'm not intending to judge the communities that I've served. I want to work on for my own self. Is there part of me, is there something within me that allowed some of that to happen or was okay with some of that happening? How did I confront it? Did I confront it? And did I own it and then try to practice the anti-racism that needs to be practiced as a leader in a church community? These are some of the things that are convicting me today as I think about anti-blackness against black children. That's this week for the virtual pilgrimage. I'm Reverend John Borthwick, and I'm grateful that you've taken the time to join me on this virtual pilgrimage and this reflection today.